We're going to briefly talk about definitions. What are we talking about? What is a short-term rental? We'll talk about the overlay zones that were recently adopted, what they are, what they mean in terms of short-term rentals. We're going to talk quite a bit about legal non-conforming registration. What is it? Who needs it? And then what is the process to apply and get approval of that registration? And then we'll talk about licensing, who can get a license, what's required, what will be required once you have a license. And then, of course, we'll save plenty of time at the end for questions. If you have not already been to this website, please go to it, take a look at it, bookmark it. This is really going to be the central location for information as updates are provided, as new processes are rolled out. All the information will be here on the city's website, steamboatsprings.net/STR. So again, if you haven't already been there, please check it out. It's informative, and we're continuing to add more information and updates as we get them. Samantha's contact information is at the bottom of that page. She's, as you can imagine, receiving a lot of calls and questions right now. So sometimes email is probably the best bet, but her phone number is there as well, and she will get back to you as soon as she can. Okay, so starting with definitions. Up until June of this year, short-term rental uses were defined in the city's community development code under a couple of different terms, those being vacation home rental or VHR. That applied to single family and duplex units. We had a definition for vacation rental. So that was a short-term rental of anything that wasn't a single family or a duplex unit. And then we also, to be even more confusing, had a term and a definition for a temporary short-term rental. And that was basically a VHR that didn't need a permit. So with the changes that were adopted by City Council and went into effect on June 15th of this year, these three terms are no longer defined or used in our code. And instead they are have been replaced with two new definitions. The main one being the short-term rental. I'm not going to read this to you, but it essentially eliminates the distinction between the type of unit. So we don't care anymore if this is a condo, a multiple family unit, a townhouse, single family home, or a duplex. If you're offering and using it for accommodation and lodging purposes for periods of time less than 30 consecutive days, then it is considered a short-term rental. The second new definition that we've added to the city's code is a hosted short-term rental. So this would be if you are occupying and living in the unit and you're offering one guest room, one bedroom for rent on a short-term basis while you're occupying and present in the home, that is considered a hosted short-term rental. So that first definition would apply to the whole unit rental when you're not there. The hosted short-term rental would allow for one guest room to be rented while you are residing and present in the unit. Okay, so the overlay zone, and the overlay zone is a new zone. So the community has a number of zone districts that provide for which uses can be allowed where in the community. The short-term rental overlay zone is just what it sounds. It doesn't change the underlying zoning of a property, but it's an overlay on top of that that specifically addresses whether short-term rental uses are allowed, and if so, how they're allowed. There are three zones that comprise the overlay zone. Zone A is the unrestricted zone. That's in the green on the map. Zone B is restricted. Those are the yellow areas, and Zone C is prohibited. Those are the red areas. Zone B has 6 subzones, and so you see those labeled there, B1 through B6, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit more in just a moment. So Zone A, that unrestricted or green zone, short-term rentals are allowed. A license is required, an annual license is required. And there is no limit on the number of licenses that we will issue in the green zones. So it's completely unrestricted, unlimited number of licenses. There are some operational requirements that will apply to licensed short-term rentals. And again, we'll get to those later in the presentation. Zone B, those yellow areas, a license, short-term rentals are also allowed in these areas. A license is required. Again, that will be an annual license. And there are a limited number of short-term rental licenses that will be available in those subzones. So those are the caps, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And I'll note that there's a big giant exception to those caps. And so I'll get to that on the next slide. But in general, there is a limited number of licenses that will be issued and available in the yellow areas. Hosted short-term rentals are unlimited, so they are not subject to the caps. They are allowed. There's no limit on the number of those licenses that we will issue. And again, operational requirements will apply to all hosted and short-term rental licensed properties. So the caps are here on this screen. You can see the number of licenses, the cap on the number of licenses per subzone. And then you also see in red that big exception that I referred to. So City Council has adopted a cap, a number per subzone that we will make licenses available for. However, we will exceed those caps for any properties that are subject to a valid VHR permit or that have registered as a legal nonconformity. And we'll talk about what those two things mean in just a moment. But just know that these caps, we expect them all to be exceeded with the exception of subzone B1, the Sunlight neighborhood. We think all the other subzones will likely exceed those caps right out of the gate because there are more existing short-term rentals in those areas than what the cap was set at. All licenses that are issued will count towards those caps in the yellow zone. So this was a question that I received a couple of times in advance of today. So if we issue a license, it counts towards the cap. And as I said, we expect to exceed the caps. And so what that means is no new licenses will likely be issued in any of those subzones. Let me back up. They're all going to be new licenses. I apologize. No license will be issued for a new short-term rental use in those subzones with the exception of B1, the Sunlight neighborhood, because we anticipate all of the existing uses to fulfill the caps and then exceed the caps out of the gate. If the caps are not met, so when we talk about Sunlight, for example, where we think we have 3 existing VHR permits, the cap is set at 5. So we anticipate there'll be available 2 licenses available and that cap will not be met. In that case, we will issue those remaining licenses through a lottery system, and we will give a 30-day public notice period to invite folks to submit their requests to be included in the lottery. We'll conduct the lottery, issue the remaining available licenses, and then we will place everybody else on a waiting list in the order, based on that lottery drawing. We are not intending to maintain wait lists for the other subzones initially because we think we'll be sort of grossly exceeding those caps. And it will take a good amount of time to see some of those existing uses go away over time. And so we will not be maintaining a wait list for those other subzones until such time as we get to a point that we foresee some licenses becoming available. And then again, we'll do a notice period and conduct a lottery to issue those available licenses. In those red areas, the prohibited zone, in concept, short-term rentals are prohibited. However, if somebody holds an existing VHR permit or they're able to register their existing short-term rental use as a legal non-conforming use, they will be eligible for a license. They will require a license to continue to operate that short-term rental use. And again, the unlimited hosted short-term rental licenses are not subject to that prohibition. They will be allowed with an unlimited number of licenses issued. And of course, the operational requirements will apply to these uses as well. In summary, you'll see here on this slide, this illustrates the overlay zone pretty well. I think you have the 3 zones, the green areas, there's no cap. The yellow areas, there is a cap, of course, with that asterisk noting that we will exceed the cap in certain situations, as well as zone C. Short-term rentals are prohibited unless you meet one of those 3 exceptions, which is a hosted short-term rental, a VHR permit, or your registered legal nonconforming short-term rental. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about legal nonconforming registration and what that means. This type of application, this type of land use approval is only applicable to properties located in zones B and C, so the yellow and red areas. If your property is located in the green zone, the use is allowed, it's an unrestricted use, and so you are not considered non-conforming. The short-term rental use is not considered non-conforming. It is considered conforming with the current code. So this is only applicable in zones B and C, and it applies to uses that were defined under the previous code as a vacation rental or a temporary short-term rental. So if you are doing short-term rental of a short-term rental use in your property in the yellow or the red zone, and if you were not subject to a vacation home rental permit previously, but you were conducting that use lawfully, you met the codes prior to June 15th, you are eligible to apply for legal nonconforming registration. In summary, that's pretty much if you're a condo or a townhome, or if you are conducting a short-term rental use in your single-family home or duplex only twice a year up to a maximum of 30 days, you could have done that without a permit in the past, in which case you can apply for legal nonconforming registration. To do so, you have to prove that you were lawfully established. You were conducting the use legally prior to June 15th, and that you haven't abandoned that use within the last 12 months. So if it was something you did 3 years ago and didn't do in the last 12 months, you would not be eligible for legal nonconforming registration. The last bullet here I think is really important. The legal nonconforming registration is not required for properties that are subject to a valid VHR permit. So it's one or the other. Either you have a VHR permit or you don't. And if you don't, then you want to go through the legal nonconforming registration process. So we so far have received about 120 of these nonconforming registration applications. Samantha and I are working through them as quickly as we can. We have issued approvals for about 40 of those so far. The other 80, we are well into the review process of, but we of course receive new applications every day. We're trying to get through these as fast as we can. But I want to talk a little bit about what the application requirements look like and what we are looking for from these applicants to make it easier for all of you to know what to submit. And of course, make it easier for us to review these in a timely manner. We don't have to continue to come back and ask for more information. So there are 4 main application requirements for this process. The first being the property owner signature form. That's what's shown here on the screen. It is available on the website, so you can download it from the website. Property owner and the applicant have to sign this form, and it also outlines the additional submittal requirements for this application. We also require proof of ownership. So if you are the property owner, or if you are not the property owner, but you're applying on somebody else's behalf, you do have to have the property owner sign the form, and you also have to submit proof that they in fact own the property. That proof can be as simple as a printout of the Routt County Assessor's page, the property record for that particular property. I put an example on the screen here. This is actually for this property, the building that we're in right here. So you can see it's for 124 10th Street. That should match the physical location for the property that you're applying for. And then it needs to list the owner. The name should match who you're identifying as the owner on that signature form. If the assessor's page hasn't been updated, if it was a recently purchased property, then any additional information you can provide, if you can provide the deed or property tax record, something that indicates who owns the property, we will accept other forms of proof. The other two requirements or submittal requirements include proof of bookings prior to June 15th. So some sort of report that itemizes the actual short-term rental bookings that you had on that property within the 12 months prior to June 15th. And then also proof of sales tax collection and remittance. And that can take a couple of different forms. And it's going to depend on how the short-term rental use operates, who collects and remits the sales tax for that property. And one important thing here to note is that there are 3 different ways you can submit proof of sales tax collection. You may have to submit more than one because more than one may apply to you, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But more importantly, what we're looking for here is that your proof of sales tax collection and remittance matches your bookings report. So if you show us the bookings report that has 12 stays and your sales tax report's only showing 1, that's going to raise a red flag for us, or vice versa. So look for, what we're looking for is proof and documentation that actually demonstrates that you have in fact used the property in the last 12 months and that you have used it lawfully. So talking about those 3 types of proof for sales tax information, the first possible document that you may submit is an affidavit that is available on the website for download. And this is required when some other entity other than the property owner is collecting and remitting sales tax on behalf of the property owner. Some other entity other than Vrbo or Airbnb. So for example, if you have a local property management company that takes care of your bookings, manages your property, collects and remits the sales tax on your behalf, they can complete this affidavit for you, sign it, make sure that they're, when they sign it, they are swearing and attesting that they in fact do what the affidavit says, and that is that they collect and remit sales tax on your behalf within the last 12 months. If you are the property owner and you collect and remit sales tax on your own behalf, then you would do so with the city sales tax license, and we would look for a copy of your valid sales tax license uploaded with your application. And that would look similar to what's on your screen. And then what we're seeing a lot of are sales tax reports that come from Airbnb and Vrbo, and that is because the city has entered into voluntary collection agreements with those 2 companies. So when your property is booked and rented on one of those 2 platforms, the sales and lodging taxes are collected by Vrbo and Airbnb, and then they are remitted to the city on your behalf. So what we're looking for, if that's the scenario that you fall into, are reports that you can get as the property owner from Vrbo or an Airbnb. I've put the names of what I believe those reports are called. There's a means by which you can download that from those websites. We're looking for a complete lodging tax report or a complete booking report. Typically, that's something that you can download in an Excel or CSV file format. And the most important thing here is that it's showing the bookings as well as the tax information. So make sure that when you download it and upload it with your application, that you don't cut off part of the information or you don't download just a summary report. We need to see that the tax was actually collected for each of your bookings. And again, depending on how you operate your short-term rental, more than one of these documents may be required. If you have a local property manager that sometimes collects your tax for you, you may need to submit the affidavit. If other times it goes through Airbnb, you may need to submit the report, both of those documents. Again, I can't stress enough that your bookings report and your tax information needs to match. Once you submit all of that information to us and we review it, verify it, we can approve the legal nonconforming registration. Once that's approved, this is really important to know, that approval runs with your land, runs with the property. So if you sell the property, the new owner retains that legal nonconforming registration. They don't have to go through the process again. It runs with the land. So, so that's, I think, a really important thing to know. The other thing to know is that it doesn't last forever. It can terminate if you abandon the use for 12 consecutive months. So if you stop renting your property on a short-term basis for a period of 12 months, that legal nonconforming registration terminates and it doesn't come back. We are now accepting applications. As I mentioned, we've received over 120 of them. And all of this information, the link to how to submit, the link to those documents for you to download are all available on the short-term rental website. Sam will field a lot of questions. If you're unsure about the documentation and you want to email her, ask her some questions first before you upload and submit, feel free to do that. The more complete and clear your application is, the easier and quicker we can review it and get you your approval letter. Please do not submit multiple applications. It just slows us down when we have duplicate applications. And if we need more information, you will hear from us. You will receive an email asking for the additional documentation or clarification that we need to move your application forward. Okay, so switching gears a little bit to licensing. What properties will be eligible for short-term rental license? I've already said this, but I feel like I can't say it enough. In Zone A, the green zone, all properties are eligible for a short-term rental license. In Zone B, the first and only licenses that we will issue will be to properties that have had a valid VHR permit as of June 15th of this year, and those that have registered as legal nonconforming short-term rentals. So that's really why that nonconforming registration is so important right now, to get that in place so that you are then eligible to receive a short-term rental license later. And as I already mentioned, if and only if we don't meet or exceed the caps per subzone, then we would be in a position to issue licenses to other properties. Hosted short-term rentals, we will always issue licenses for. And then in the red zones, same situation, VHR permits and registered nonconformities will be able to receive a short-term rental license, even though they're in the prohibited zone, as will hosted short-term rentals. The license requirements will include an application fee. It will be an annual renewal, so it will be a process that you'll go through on an annual basis. Remember, I said the legal nonconforming registration is one and done. You do it once, you don't have to renew that annually, but the short-term rental license that comes after that will be required to be renewed annually. The license itself is non-transferable. It does not run with the land. So if you sell your property, the new owner has to apply for a short-term rental license in their name. And the reason for that is that the license is issued to the person, not to the property. And there are requirements that we will go over in a second, that we want to ensure that that new owner, that new licensee understands the restrictions and requirements of operating a short-term rental. And that is really the reason why the licenses do not transfer. Part of that application process will include a self-inspection checklist. So just pretty basic property maintenance checklist, ensuring that there are working smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, fire extinguishers, that kind of thing. We're not requiring a full building code inspection, but just some basic life safety items that we want you to walk through in the home and attest through an affidavit that you have in fact done that and they are all in working order. Those operational standards that I've referred to a couple of times include occupancy limits, and that is will be a maximum number of occupants in the unit based on 1 occupant per 150 square feet of the unit, up to a maximum of 16. We will be looking for some sort of parking plan indicating how many spaces are available for your unit and where they're located. We will be asking for you to designate a local responsible party, and this has to be somebody who can respond to complaints within the maximum complaint response time that you see on the screen. So during the daytime hours, that's 1 hour. And between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., that maximum response time cuts down to 30 minutes. So again, this is why new owners will require a new license, because they may want to change who their local contact person is, depending on who they are working with to manage their property. There are a couple of other operational standards. You can review the full code language in the licensing code at section 12-542. And that licensing code, that complete ordinance, is available on the short-term rental website right at the top of the page. This is a question we get multiple times a day. So this is important. We are not yet accepting license applications. We are still in the process of configuring our licensing and permitting software to get the submittal requirements, the application process, the review workflow, approval and renewal process in place. I do not have a timeline, unfortunately, yet for when that will go live. As soon as I know it, that information will be on the website, and detailed information on how to apply and exactly what we're looking for submittal requirements will be found there. We also will likely have multiple of these live Q&A sessions when we get to that, to talk specifically about the license applications. We know we're going to be receiving a lot of these, maybe over 3,000 of them. So we want to make this process as painless for all of you as well as for us as we can. So look for more information on that. We will get it out as soon as we can. One of the other common questions that I've been hearing is, are we going to extend the January 1 deadline since we're not able to accept applications yet? That's yet to be determined. However, depending on when the applications go live, we will have to assess how much time we have left for the public to respond, as well as staff capacity. And if we have to extend that deadline, we will work with City Council to evaluate our options and make that information known to the public. So I don't have a definitive answer on that timeline yet, but we of course are not going to be able to stick to a January 1 deadline if we don't get this live till December 1st. So just kind of know that that's still in flux, and we will continue to communicate that information. That conducts or concludes my presentation. I think what we'll do at this point is try to take any questions from folks in the room. We'll go through the Zoom folks. If you have questions and you're online, if you want to raise your hand, we'll get to you. And then I'll scan through any of the comments I received via email ahead of time and answer any if they haven't already been answered. So we have a, well, we do need a microphone because then the folks online can hear you.
Yeah, there's 100 people online, so that's the main reason.
So if the application isn't going to be available potentially, let's say not until December 1st, like you're saying, and the cutoff is January 1st for the deadline. If the application still isn't out by January 1st, are we still allowed to keep going with our rentals, or are we going to be penalized because the application isn't out?
No, and again, I don't want to alarm anyone. I'm not saying it's not going to be available till December 1st. We will adjust the grace period as needed. So if we have to adjust that January 1st deadline, that will extend the grace period. So we won't expect uses to stop because this is really dependent on us getting that application out and available to you all. So we will adjust that. I just can't tell you yet today what that's going to look like. I need to have a little more time to work with our software provider to get a definitive timeline on when that's going to be live and available to the public.
Rebecca, do you want to go every other, we can, because we've got 3 queued in Zoom as well, or stay,
Let's grab this
okay.
right here and then we'll go to Zoom.
Few questions, if that's okay. The first one is you said that the short-term rental licenses are non-transferable, new property owners. So if you're in the red zone, but you had a VHR, so you're vested and you sell your property, is that new property owner able to apply for a short-term rental?
Yes, because the vacation home rental, that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. The vacation home rental permit, similar to the legal non-conforming registration, runs with the land. So that permit is vested, it would transfer to the new owner, and that would then allow them to receive the short-term rental license.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask another one if that's okay. It's just kind of maybe silly. So the response times that you give, the hour or 30 minutes, is that physical response, a call? I know it has to be a local person, but if they're unavailable to come over at that point, is it a phone call?
It could be. So the response times will be coordinated with the 24-hour complaint hotline, which will go live once we have these uses licensed. And the way that will work is that a complaint that comes in through the hotline will automatically reach out via phone, text, email to the contact person. And the contact person then will have to respond. And that response will be to whatever extent is appropriate for the circumstance. So if they can make a quick phone call and say, hey, quiet the party down, and that works, and we can they'll have an opportunity to document that through the complaint hotline. So we know that they did in fact receive the call, they took action, and the action, that response resolved the situation. We will have a means to track all of that data and track the response to that complaint. If they make a phone call and no one answers the phone, and that, I don't think that that's a response that's adequate. It may require on-site response. And again, it also may depend on the nature of the complaint and what's really warranted.
I do have one quick one. So we are talking about remodeling, and in Steamboat, it's taking a very long time. So if you remodel and you're not able to rent for that period of time, but you had a license, are you penalized the next year then to apply for your license again? So say you remodeled, so for an entire year, you weren't able to rent, but you have a consistent years-long demonstration of renting, but you had to postpone that because of a remodeling. Are you able then? I mean, we live in the red zone, so.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, so with the abandonment language in the code with regard to non-conforming registrations, if you don't use the use for 12 months, then that is abandoned. I think the remodel or some other circumstance that could potentially prevent you from renting is a really good question that I don't know that I can answer today. But I can look into that. And if before we leave, if I can just get a contact email or phone number from you, I can get back to you on that. Okay, let's see. Let's go to, we'll take a few questions on Zoom. Brooks, iPhone, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. How many people are allowed in a hosted short-term rental in a single family home?
It would be subject to those same occupancy limits. So it would be based on the square footage of the guest room.
Okay, and what was that?
It's 1 occupant per 150 square feet. And I should also note that the guest room has a limitation of 400 square feet. So 2 people.
Okay, so 2 people can only be rented in a single family home. Also,
In a hosted short-term rental.
right, in a hosted short-term rental single family home. Also, are you allowed to add photos? Like if you're creating your Airbnb online, are you allowed to add photos of the house that's existing? Like you're selling the room, but they're also, the person is also able to use the kitchen, the TV inside the house. It's a shared space. So are you allowed to include those things on your listing?
Yeah, I believe you could. The nature of a hosted short-term rental could include shared space, and I think you could include photos of that.
Okay, just as long as you're listing for 2 people, but all spaces are available to them.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, perfect. And then my last one was if you were doing a hosted short-term rental in the red zone, or it was a yellow zone actually, and then it turned to red, and you didn't have to have a permit for a hosted short-term rental, are you still able to do it without a permit up until January?
I don't know if I entirely understand your question. So in all zones, green, yellow, or red, hosted short-term rentals are allowed regardless of what type of unit you're in.
Okay.
And currently the deadline is January 1 to get a short-term rental license for that use.
Right. But before June 15th, you didn't need a permit for a hosted short-term rental. So are you still able to do that without a permit to continue doing your hosted short-term rental until January? That's my question.
Yes. Okay, I understand
Okay.
now. So yes, we are
Yeah.
in a grace period. So nobody has the ability to get a short-term rental license right now. So you can continue your use if it was lawfully established prior to June 15th. You're able to continue that use through to the point by which you get the short-term rental license.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you.
All right, let's take another one. Stephen Jones, if you want to unmute.
A question on occupancy. The occupancy stated was 1 per 150 square feet. Is that correct?
Correct.
So that would work out to, if you had 1,150 square foot condo, 7.6 people. If your HOA requirements are less than that, who takes precedent?
Well, typically the more restrictive set of standards would take precedent. However, in the city's review of that license, we would issue the license based on the city's code, and it would be up to your HOA to enforce their more restrictive covenants.
Can you make part of the approval somehow to communicate with the HOA so they're in sync so we don't have to fight?
No, well, the city we do not enforce HOA covenants. There's
But you're
really
not,
an unlimited number of ways in which the city codes and HOA rules could differ. And so the city's responsibility is to enforce our own codes and review applications based on our own codes. So we've
Will
talked a
the-
bit about this in the process, and I think it creates a lot of confusion, and it's very cumbersome, especially well, I'll just leave it at that. We would not be in a position to enforce HOA covenants.
not that you should. It's, is there a way that the approval process for a particular HOA can alert the HOA so that we know which ones are approved, and then the HOA can go after the issue I just discussed?
That's a good question. So it wouldn't be through the approval process. We wouldn't have a notification requirement. But I do believe that all of the licensed properties would be a matter of public record, and we would make that information available on the city's website. So you would be able to see which properties in your HOA were issued a short-term rental license.
So it'll be by HOA?
It'd be by address, location is how you could identify those.
Okay, thank you.
Darby, you want to pass the mic?
Going off of what this gentleman was just mentioning, so you're saying that you'll enforce your occupancy rules, like he said, 7.6, but in the case that the HOAs is 6, and you're saying that the city's only going to enforce your number, the higher number, what happens when that owner begins to be fined by their HOA because they're going by city ordinances and not the HOA's rules and policies? Because the HOAs will fine for going over the occupancy for following your ordinance. So who would be taking care of that fine for that owner?
Well, the owner would be responsible. So I think an owner is always responsible to be in compliance with both city code and their HOA rules. And it's really the burden is and the responsibility is on them to know both of those and to abide by the more restrictive. So just because the city were to issue a permit that would allow 7 occupants, if they are restricted by their HOA to 6, then they would need to abide by those rules. And if they don't, they're subject to whatever fines are levied against them by their HOA. Similarly, if the HOA allowed more occupants than what the city code, I mean, it would be a similar situation. It would just be that the city would be enforcing the more restrictive standard, even if they're in full compliance with their HOA. All right, we've got Leslie Williams on Zoom.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. Just have a few questions. Do you know how much the rental or the renewal or the short-term rental application will be?
Another very popular question that I don't have an answer for quite yet, but we are working on the fee calculation. We are still trying to factor in all of the costs of city to administer the program. So the way the fee will work is that it will be set at an amount that will cover the cost to the city. So staff time and any resources that we have to put into administering, licensing, and enforcing the rules. So I don't have that number yet, but we are working on finalizing that and we will communicate that out via the website.
Okay.
And that will be known in advance of the license application going live so that you'll have that information as soon as we know it.
Awesome, thank you. And then will property management companies be able to apply for the applicant or for that license on behalf of owners?
Yes, the applicant can be someone other than the property owner, but as I mentioned, you'll have to have the property owner's permission
Sure.
by way of a sign off on the form or the application.
Okay. And then property management companies, I'm assuming, can also be the local responsible party.
Of course, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Did we have another? Okay, we have one in the room and then we'll go back to Zoom.
Thanks, Rebecca, for doing this. It's good to clear up some of these things. One quick question on the non-conforming processing. Sounds like you've processed 40. I know I applied about 2 months ago and haven't heard anything back. It seems like this is more of an observation than a question. It seems unlikely you will be able to process 2,000 to 3,000 non-conforming permits in the next 90 days to be ready to issue short-term rental permits to all those people. Is that not a realistic number of what you're expecting?
Yeah, we don't anticipate that we have 2,000 to 3,000 non-conforming registrations.
Okay.
Remember,
Because
the bulk
the
of our
A zone.
short-term rentals are in the green zone. They don't need the registration. So we think the number could be likely more closer to 400 would be my guess. And also know that as we go through this, we're getting faster as we go. And I just want to be clear, we have approved 40. That doesn't mean we haven't already reviewed another, the other 80. It's just that they haven't gone through all of the steps in the review process. So planning staff, Sam looks at those, reviews all of the documents. Our finance staff also reviews those documents. So there's several steps in that review process. So there's probably another 40 or so that are just about ready to be approved.
Would your advice be that anyone who has been waiting because there's no step past that to go ahead and submit that because it's going to take some time?
Yes, please. We really want to get the non-conforming registrations through the process because like I said, they're sort of a one and done deal. This is a lot of work on the front end of this implementation that we won't have to come back and do again. And then we can focus on the short-term rental licenses.
One more question. I own a triplex that is a short-term rental. So there's 3 different units. I submitted 1 application. Do I need to submit 3 applications?
Yes, and I know which application yours is,
Okay.
and that's why you're not hearing from us, because it's falling. We need separate applications.
You don't want to deal with my problems. I get you.
Well, no, and I'm not trying to, I don't want to sound that way, that you're falling to the bottom of the list, but we're trying to get through the ones that are straightforward and easy and get them off our plate first. But yes, and I will reach out to you and we can talk through that because I know exactly which application you are.
Thank you.
I looked at it this morning, actually. I should have emailed you. All right, let's go to Sam on Zoom.
Hi, a few quick questions. First one is kind of to piggyback on what you're just discussing. If I'm the owner of two properties, is that two applications that need to be submitted, not just one with both addresses?
Yes, this licenses and legal nonconforming registration are both issued per property address. So if you have
two
multiple
applications.
properties, correct.
Gotcha. Okay. Second question, if one of my condos is 285 square feet, that means
Oh, Sam, I think we just lost you. You muted.
oh, sorry about that. If I have a condo that's 285 square feet, does that mean a couple is not permitted to stay there? Only an individual can stay there?
Well, yes, based on the occupancy limits. However, there may be a scenario, I'll have to go back and review the code, where we could evaluate unique circumstances. A condo that's only 280 square feet, is that what you said?
285?
285. I think that's probably a fairly unique scenario. So if you can reach out to me directly after this presentation, we can chat about what options there might be.
Okay. And then the last question, apologies. If I know that we're going to have the complaint hotline that we'll need to respond to, and we have those timelines. And there has been a discussion of, whether it's multiple strikes or what the penalties will be for infractions. Will there at any point in time be any level of categorization or like a posted notice of what those fines are, number one? And then number two, is there anything that we can do to protect our property from someone erroneously continuing to report loud noise when there, say, is not loud noise?
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So our enforcement, the enforcement of the rules is not based on complaint. I mean, it may be initiated because of a complaint, but we are not assessing fines or taking enforcement action based on number of complaints. So the way that the code is written, if there's a complaint, it needs to be responded to by your 24-hour contact. If it's responded to, that doesn't mean that if there was a violation, that doesn't mean the violation goes away and didn't happen. We can still take enforcement action. So remember that the response time is really intended to address the situation, to stop the violation, to give the neighbors some relief in a timely manner. It's not intended to suggest that the violation didn't occur. So we will follow up, our enforcement staff will follow up on the complaint, investigate the complaint, and determine if there's any evidence of that complaint. And then it would be referred to a hearings officer. We would submit the evidence that we've collected if we felt that there was a violation. And the hearings officer has the ability to evaluate that. You, as the property owner, would have the ability to provide your own evidence, refute the complaint, whatever the case is. And then the hearings officer would decide what would be the appropriate penalty. So it could be a warning, it could be some sort of fine, it could be a suspension, or they could recommend revocation, and that would have to go to city council. So there's a lot of discretion there for the hearings officer to evaluate the complaint, the severity of the situation, the number of times perhaps that you've been in front of the hearings officer, and what that proof looks like before they would assess a penalty. So it's not just based on complaints. So if they're truly sort of false complaints, that's going to kind of bear out in the lack of proof. And again, keep in mind that as we collect the complaint information and we start to enforce the new codes, we will learn as we go. And if we have to modify the enforcement procedures to respond to some of the issues that we're seeing arise, we can do that. Does that help you? I wanted to
That's a
also
great
just
answer.
note what we have learned from a lot of property managers is that they install noise monitoring devices in the units.
I was going to ask specifically about that.
So we're not requiring that of you, but if that provides you some level of confidence that you're able to better manage your guests, that may be one thing to consider.
It would be hopefully to manage the guests as well as have proof on our hands if those erroneous calls do happen, that we can refer to that noise monitor and say, based on this monitor, there was no noise, would be the hope.
All right, we have another question in the back of the room. Darby, if you want to. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go up here. Thank you.
Okay. First, thanks for holding this session. It's much appreciated. And my question is this: we own a duplex in the red zone. And the question is, if we are, say, renting, and it's up and down, say we're renting either top or bottom, but living in one of the units, does that qualify as a hosted short-term rental?
No, so a duplex is considered two separate dwelling units. So that would not be hosted. It would be considered a short-term rental of that, of one of the dwelling units that comprises the duplex. And I did want to just, now that I know that you're in a duplex, that means you have a VHR permit, correct?
Yep.
So back to the earlier question that I think you folks asked about remodeling. Because you have a VHR permit, you are not subject to the legal nonconforming requirements. So that 12-month abandonment period does not apply to you. Yep. You'll just want to ensure that you maintain the annual short-term rental license, even if you're not actually using it for that period of time.
Okay, thank
Yep.
you.
All right, let's go back to the back of the room.
In reference to Sam's previous question about complaints or everything in that manner, I work for Vacasa. So for our company, we're a management company like Moving Mountains, Retreatia. We get complaints a lot, every day almost. Are you guys going to have a enforcement team that contacts people in our management company for these sort of complaints, being able to get back to the tenants, etc.?
Yeah, so if the complaint comes directly to us through the hotline, that will reach out to whoever is listed as the contact for that particular unit right away. And then if it's something that we have to follow up with and investigate, we will do that. And we will, of course, be in touch with the property manager to conduct that investigation. So I like to think of the complaint hotline and these enforcement procedures as sort of being beneficial to all parties, and that it gives a central location for neighbors to submit complaints. It helps make sure that we're aware of them because we're not working in the middle of the night. So oftentimes by the morning, the neighbors don't feel like dealing with it anymore. So that I think there's times that we don't hear about things. And then also for the property manager, same holds true. If you don't know that the guests in your units aren't behaving responsibly, then unfortunately you don't have the ability to respond or do anything about it. So we're trying to make sure we have a system in place that it sort of benefits all parties and that everybody can work towards the common goal of responsible guests in short-term rentals. All right, let's go to Heather Fitzgerald on Zoom.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. When, if ever, will the zoning colors be re-examined in terms of their boundaries?
we don't have any requirement that they in fact be re-examined, similar to all other zoning. There is a rezoning request process by which a property owner could request rezoning. That would force that question to be re-examined for that particular property. However, I do think City Council maybe had, suggested, and I think staff would agree it's a good idea to let the regulations work or function for about a year or so, and then maybe come back and say, how's this working? Or, is it working as intended? Do we need to make any changes to it? So we don't have a set schedule. There's no requirement that something gets reevaluated on a specific timeline, but I think it will be something that we will try to evaluate on an annual basis, at least for the first couple of years.
Okay, so as a follow-up, like if you are in the green zone now, you could be rezoned to yellow or whatever, just whenever the city decides to open up a rezoning process, if ever. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is correct. Zoning is a legislative action. It is the purview of City Council. There are public notice requirements for that. So it wouldn't be something that we would pursue and that council would do without any type of public notice and afford the public the opportunity to comment and participate in that decision.
Thank you.
Tara?
Hi. I just have a few quick questions for you. The first one's in reference to the local responsible party. I have a VHR now and a duplex, and the HOA that I'm in is significantly more restrictive than the city. And so I am not permitted to rent it unless I'm at home. So my question is, for the responsible party, I would always put my name or my husband's name on it, simply because we can't go on vacation if we're renting the other duplex or the other side. So would that be acceptable to put our own names down because we can't rent it otherwise? Does that make sense?
Yeah, if you are a local party and you have the ability to respond, you're saying you would be in town renting
I'm saying
a
we own
different
a
unit?
duplex. We live in one side, we rent the other side.
Yeah, you could
Correct.
definitely name yourself as the contact.
Okay. Okay, perfect. And then the other is, you had mentioned that once someone is permitted or given a non-conforming, it goes with the property. What happens if you live in a yellow zone and you have a VHR, so I don't have to actually get the non-conforming licensing? Does that then go with the property as well?
Yeah, VHR permits run with the land.
Oh, they
And
do? Okay.
so that would transfer automatically to any new owner, and then that would provide them the opportunity to obtain the new short-term rental license.
Okay, perfect. That's it.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you so much.
Did I see another hand in the room? Top.
So if some of these owners for their applications for their point of contact, they're just putting themselves down there when in reality it should be, for instance, their property management company. Isn't that going to be alarming if the owner is getting a call from you guys saying that codes are being broken or that there's something that needs to be enforced instead of the property management company contacting them instead?
You're asking if it will alarm them if the city enforcement contacts them that there's been a complaint?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it may. If they're choosing to be their 24-hour contact for their unit, then they should expect calls if we need to contact them about their unit.
But shouldn't you guys be reaching out rather to the property management company itself and those managers to try to solve the problem first before contacting that person? Especially when they have things put in place for 24-hour watching and security to avoid
We can
those?
only contact who the owner designates as their property contact. So if we don't know who the property manager is, because they didn't tell us that in their application, and they have elected to be their 24-hour contact, then that's who we're going to contact and that's who we're going to expect to respond to the complaint.
Okay.
So if they don't want to be that person, then I would think that they would designate their property manager, but we will contact whoever they designate on their application. And that might be at 3 a.m. Okay, let's go to Terry Jones on Zoom.
All right, quick question. If there is an issue with the application that you submitted, are you guys contacting those people?
Are we talking about legal non-conforming registration?
Correct.
Yes, we are. So as we get them in, Sam takes a look at the documents. If she notices right away that something's missing, she does try to send an email right away indicating that the application is incomplete, and we won't continue processing it until the documents are uploaded that we need. And then if through our reviews, through the planning and finance reviews, if we have questions, need clarification, or need additional documentation, yes, we will reach out via email and let you know.
Okay, so I'm gonna assume that mine is close and everything's good because it's been there for 5 weeks and I haven't seen anything.
So there's a couple of things you can do. You can log into your CityView portal and you can click on My Items and you can look at the status of your application. So if you do that, if we're waiting for submittals or a resubmittal or something like that, you'll notice it there. So you can track the status of your application online. And if you haven't heard from us, then typically it means that we don't need additional information at this point, but we will reach out to you. And like I said earlier, we are working through these as fast as we can. So I would take a look at the status. And then if you have questions, you can always email Sam
Okay,
specifically.
great. Thank you.
Austin?
Yes, hello. Thanks for your time, and apologies, my computer disconnected, so if you have to repeat yourself, sorry in advance. Just regarding the licensing applications and approaching the end of the year, can you remind me what that grace period is going to be as we approach that?
Yeah, so as of right now, the grace period ends January 1. And when I know more about, when I have a specific timeline in place for when the license applications will go live, we will adjust that grace period if we need to. I can't tell you what that is yet until I have a timeline on when the applications will go live.
Okay.
But we, of course, want to make it doable. We know that there's a lot of folks out there waiting, and we also know there's a lot of a huge workload on our part. So we'll need to make sure that timeline is doable for all parties.
Absolutely. And the best way to check on that is just keep going to the city website.
Yeah, it's going to keep telling you that we don't know yet. And then one day we're going to know, and it's going to be right there on the website. So yes, please keep checking on that. We'll get it up as soon as we know it.
Okay, perfect. The other one is there a public record location where we can view the current STR numbers versus the total caps for yellow zones?
We have some estimates of what we think is out there, but until we license them, we won't know exactly, how much we exceed those caps. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As I mentioned at the beginning, we anticipate that all of the yellow zones will exceed the caps with the exception of one.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And then did you mention a license application fee amount or no?
Yeah, we're working on that. We don't have that fee established yet, but we will know that soon, and we will get that information on the website.
Okay, and then I believe on one of the docs, there was that short list of operational requirements as far as proof of ownership and those few details, the safety inspection. Is that pretty much it, or will there be a different list once we get to the actual application?
There may be some additional application materials, but if you take a look at the licensing ordinance, which is available on the website for download, you can see per the ordinance, per the code language, exactly what we'll be looking for. So it includes the occupancy requirements, parking,
Right.
self-inspection checklist. There's some sort of minor requirements about that you'll have to post rules somewhere visible in the unit with regard to who to contact if there's a problem, what to do, how to handle trash, where they can park, sort of the rules of the unit, so to speak.
Okay, so very similar, if not identical to what the VHR applications were like.
Very similar to the VHR. Yes.
Okay, that's all I got. Thank you so much.
Okay. Did we have another question in the room?
Yeah, so I was just hoping to talk about the when a property sells and what that looks like, because I've gotten a lot of questions about that, and if they're a non-conforming use holder or not, and depending if they're probably in the red or yellow zones, what does that look like?
Yeah. So if they're in the yellow and the red zones, if they have a VHR permit or if they have a legal non-conforming registration, those two approvals run with the land. So the new owner would sort of obtain those approvals by way of purchasing the property. And those approvals would give them the opportunity to apply for and receive a short-term rental license. So licenses do not transfer because they are issued to the person, the property owner. So the new property owner would have to apply for and obtain a new license, but we would issue that license based on those underlying land use approvals, the VHR permit or the legal non-conforming registration, because those would transfer with the sale of the property. Does that make sense?
Yes, and in regards to caps, will they just need to get in line for the next available license?
No, we will always issue licenses to folks that have one of those underlying zoning approvals, legal non-conforming or VHR. So those will always be eligible to receive a new short-term rental license.
Thank you. And then the next question, so based on a previous question on 24-hour contacts, they don't necessarily need to be physically present in order to be able to be that contact and try to mitigate the issue. They can, phone a neighbor or something like that if they need to be like physically on site, or how does that work?
Yeah, the code. So we're not requiring that you actually have to physically show up at the property to respond. But I would say that if we were getting contacts for people who were were located elsewhere, that to me would not be a valid local 24-hour contact. Because we do need it to be somebody who can respond on site if the situation warrants it. So the concept is the intent is that it is someone who's local and who is available and can respond accordingly depending on the circumstance. Does that answer your question? Okay. Let's go Kristen on Zoom.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to know how the complaint hotline was going to work if a complaint is made about someone who is not hosting a short-term rental, if it's a long-term tenant or owner's guest.
Yeah, so those are kind of two different scenarios. So let's assume it's a long-term tenant and there's no short-term rental license for that property. That property address won't really show up in the system. So we'll have the complaint information, and the complaint hotline will identify that there's no licensed short-term rental at that location. And so there won't be any automatic calls. The hotline won't have anyone to contact. Rather, our enforcement staff would likely follow up with that on the next day just to look into it, make sure there's not some sort of illegal short-term rental activity happening there. And if it's not short-term rental related, then our enforcement staff would handle it like we do any other complaint that we get that's not short-term rental related. So we would evaluate whether it was a violation of any city codes, and we would refer it to the police or to municipal code as appropriate, or municipal court, I'm sorry, as appropriate. Same with if it's an owner's guest. So keep in mind, a lot of short-term rentals are not always short-term rentals. It's an intermittent use where it's really classified as a short-term rental when it's being used as such. If the owner is there and not using it as a short-term rental, then it's a residential use. It's not a short-term rental. And so we would have to sort of sort that out through our investigation of that complaint. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. KW?
Hi, thank you. In the past, I believe there was an allowance for homeowners to short-term rent their house for like less than 2 weeks a year or something like that. For example, if you're here year-round and you leave for Christmas to New Year's, is that something that's still going to be allowed?
That's a great question. So in the code as adopted, that exemption does not exist. However, at the time of adoption, City Council did direct staff to bring an amendment back that would allow for that type of activity. So what the prior code allowed for was short-term rentals of a single family or duplex unit up to 2 times a year or a maximum of 30 cumulative days. And so we would likely model the new exemption similar to that. Of course, not limiting it to single family or duplex homes, but allowing it in all residential units. And what I understood council's directive was to allow for that limited exemption for primary residences only. But that will be something that staff will prepare a draft amendment to the code and take it to City Council for public hearings and ultimate adoption.
Okay. And one more
Wait,
question.
I'm sorry, and real quick, I should note, we do intend to have that, to bring that to City Council in a timeline by which, if council decides to approve that, we can implement that prior to the end of the grace period.
Okay, thanks. Also, and just to clarify, I know you've probably already said this, but I just want to reiterate. You mentioned that if you have a current valid VHR permit and you're in the yellow zone, you don't have to provide proof of rental of that short-term unit in the last 12 months, and that's only for the legal non-conforming registration. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I had.
Do we have any more in the room?
Curiosity to follow up with that. If you get that exemption for the 30-day, whatever short occasional use, will people be required to have a license and the contact and all that?
Yes. That is what I foresee. Of course, until we provide a draft to City Council, we can see where that goes. But that would be my intention, is that all short-term rental activities require a license. Darby, we have one more.
Sorry, real quick. After hearing other people talking about the 24-hour contact, I've had a couple occasions where I've had to change management companies fairly quickly. Will there be a easy process to change that 24-hour contact?
Yes, we will make sure that that is accommodated either through the online permitting system, or it could be a phone call to our department and we can go in and change that information at any time. Because that's really important that it's up to date, or the wrong folks are going to be getting calls, and that's going to be a problem. Christopher on Zoom.
Good afternoon. My question is about, you had mentioned exceptions to the 150 square foot requirement. Specifically, I'm thinking about a lot of the units in the green zone that were designed for 2 couples or for families. Many of those units would be disqualified from being able to host a family. As an example, could be a 500 square foot unit, which wouldn't allow for a couple to have children. So what is the process to get the exception for a unit that very well is designed to hold more people than the current restrictions allow?
I don't have an answer to that question. at the moment. I have to look into the licensing code and what remedies there may or may not be. At this point, there's not a variance process. There's not an exception process. So I have to just do a little bit of research in terms of whether there are any remedies for situations where there are special circumstances. But otherwise, I would say just sort of globally, the occupancy limits have been established by code, and I would say that they stand.
Okay, so the short-term rentals will be held to a different accountability than, say, a hotel room in the same zone?
I don't know what kinds of occupancy limits exist for hotel rooms, so I don't know that I can speak to that.
Okay, thank you.
Larry?
Yeah, Rebecca, this is Larry Mashaw from Resort Group. My question also relates to emergency contact information. And I'm wondering if property managers will have an opportunity to look at those lists to see if anybody has assigned them contact responsibility for properties we no longer or do not currently manage.
That's a really great question. I'll have to give some thought as to how we might be able to do that. Let me give that a little bit of thought, Larry. I mean, the license applications and information are public record. Through our City View software, a lot of that information is viewable by the public at any time. So I would say just sort of initially, for example, if you managed a particular unit and then that property owner changed management companies and you wanted to ensure that you were no longer listed, I think it would be fairly easy for you to look that up through the system to identify whether you were listed as the property manager, and then you could alert us and we could reach out to that permittee and let them know that they need to, or that licensee, and let them know that they need to update that information. But I'll give that a little bit more thought in terms of how we might be able to streamline that for the larger management companies.
Right, because the idea is obviously to get ahead of that before an emergency call is made, because then you'd just be discovering it at that point. And on a related comment, we have property management companies who are not in the nightly rental business and therefore should not be assigned responsibilities for emergency contact. We want to make sure that those properties owners don't inadvertently list a company who does not provide services they have not contracted for.
Yeah, understood. Let me give that a little bit of thought, and we can work through that as we configure the licensing process.
All right, thanks for all your diligent work on this.
Deb Weiss.
Thank you. I spent too much time listening and not enough time actually looking at where my property is. So now that I've done that and I'm in the green zone, am I to take away that I don't really have to do anything until the short-term rental license application is available? And at that point, that's what I would need to fill out.
That is correct.
Perfect.
You're good to go for a little while.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Molly?
Hi, yeah, my question is regarding the running with the land. I'm just wondering how exactly that is being done. So I got my approval for non-conforming legal use back in July. And looking on like the assessor's record, it's still, nothing is on there. Nothing's been recorded against the property as far as I'm aware. And the letter that I received approving application, XYZ, does not even reference the property address. Because my plan was just to record that approval so that it's at least in the chain of title. But I'm just wondering, you guys keep saying it runs with the land. How?
Molly, thank you for that question. I think you sent that to me via email. So, yeah, we can look at our, do you have can you borrow your cord? Hold on, Molly, 1 second.
Okay.
dies fast when it starts to die. Oh, okay. Sorry about that, Molly. I was just about to lose my computer. So we can take a look at our approval letter template and see if we can add the property address. But just so that you know, our permitting system ties that approval to the property address itself and to the parcel ID number. So that is all a matter of public record, and we would be able to, based on that application number, identify that that approval was granted to that particular piece of real property. I
Okay.
also would just note that even if it's recorded, that can show up in the chain of title, which is great. But keep in mind that the legal nonconforming status doesn't last forever if that use is ever abandoned, that we would terminate that approval in our permitting system and our records, and that may differ from a recorded document.
Okay, so I just couldn't think of another way for it to like run with the land in that like people are on notice. So I'm just wondering, because for me, like if I log in to check on the application number, yes, it says it's approved, but like where is the database if not on the assessor's record that shows a certain home has been approved or not approved or whatever the zoning is, if not the assessor?
Yeah, so the zoning information and land use approvals are a matter of city record.
Okay.
They don't typically, the assessor doesn't maintain a database of that. So there's not really a good way to connect those two systems. But we could, I mean, if it would make you feel better, and like I said, we can certainly look at our approval letter template and make sure that it includes an address for the property, and we can reissue that approval letter for you if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be great. Because it does on the assessor, it does say only long-term rentals. And that did change when the zoning changed from allowed to red. So there is something in the assessor that's pulling from zoning somewhere, updating rental allowances.
Yeah, I would have to look at what you're looking at, what you're seeing on the assessor's records. The assessor's database may identify the city zoning layer. And it may also reference the way the property is being used, but it is not making reference to any type of city land use approval. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just,
I would just never rely on assessor classifications to indicate city zoning or land use approval. It's a common misconception that you can identify on the county assessor's website what your property is approved for per city zoning.
okay. So if someone like was buying a property and pulled title work, the approval or lack of approval would show up?
No, they would have to contact us and we would, we could verify that record exists, or they could search it in the city's permitting system.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Philip?
Yes, I just want to make sure I understand the legal non-conforming registration. Are there any fees associated with that?
There is not an application fee for that process. There will be a fee for the short-term rental license, however.
Okay, good to know. Second question, I'm working with a management company and they are doing a mass submittal for all of us owners that use them. Is there a way I can tell that my registration is being processed properly, and that something doesn't get missed so I don't have to fight problems later?
So let me understand. So your property management company has submitted the application on your behalf?
Yes, for the legal non-conforming registration so far.
Sure. So you should be able to, if you go to the short-term rental website, there's a link for the City View portal. you can click on that. You should be able to search for your property by property address, or if you can get the application number from your property manager, you can put in the application number and you should be able to see the status of your application. You could also email us and ask us to add you as a contact to that application, and we can add your email address and phone number. And that'll give you the ability to view the documents as they go through the process.
Okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, so if you want to email me with your address, I can see if I can find it on our end, or email Sam, and we can make sure that you're added as a contact, which will give you the ability to view everything that your property manager has submitted.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. We've got one more on Zoom, Paul.
Yes, so you mentioned that, in the prior 12 months, it had to be a lawful with the sales tax collection and stuff. So if you were taking advantage of the prior code that allowed you to do it twice a year for less than 30 days, but you didn't collect sales tax because you weren't aware you had to collect sales tax for it, does that mean it's a no-go on applying for legal non-conforming status, or are you guys allowing, exceptions as long as you can prove that you rented it?
So you have to prove that you rented it lawfully, and our code allowed for that exception without a permit, but it explicitly stated that you had to have a sales tax license and you had to collect and remit sales tax. Our sales tax code applies to all uses regardless of whether you needed a permit or not. I can't speak to whether finance would allow you to remit those taxes after the fact. So I would suggest that you reach out to the finance department at the city and speak to them about what avenue, if any, that you have to remit those taxes. But if you didn't collect or remit those, generally speaking, that you were not operating that use in a lawful fashion.
Okay,
However,
so
keep in mind, as I mentioned, we do anticipate coming back and amending the code to add that provision back in to allow for those limited occurrences. So even if you're not able to demonstrate legal non-conforming under the old code, there may be in the future an avenue for you to just establish a new use under the new code. Does that make sense?
Yes, but your recommendation right now is if I wanted to apply for legal non-conforming status is first talk to the finance department, see if I could square away the taxes, and then submit the application.
Yes, I can't speak to what their policies and what our codes say with regard to sales tax. So I don't want to advise you improperly. So I would start with finance and see if you have any, any avenue there to bring that up to, to rectify the situation.
Okay. And then on a separate note, why is the legal non-conforming status and the VHR permit, why are they associated with the land so that they go on and on and on and not just with the current owner and once they sell it? Because I mean, I thought, the whole point of this was to reduce the number of short-term rentals in the city.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So land use permits, which is a vacation home rental permit, was in our community development code. It is considered a land use approval, as well as a legal non-conforming registration. Those are based in our zoning code, and approvals that are granted for land uses. Those types of approvals run with the land. And so licensing works a little bit different when you issue a license to a person. That works a little bit different than when you're granting a land use approval. The VHR permit, for example, granted the approval for that property to be used for that type of use. It wasn't based on who owned it. It was a permit that allowed that type of use to occur on that particular piece of real property. And that's just sort of generally how land use approvals work.
And so we're stuck with this in terms of being associated with the land versus, I mean, it sounds like to me is, those who had the VHR permits Particularly, I mean, since they were pretty much primarily in single family homes, they were the only ones required to have those, have a golden ticket. Since not only does it forever follow the land, they actually don't even, according to what you were saying earlier, they just have to have a license each year. They don't even actually have to actually use it. They can just keep it with it versus the legal non-conforming status. Not only do they have to have the license, they got to use it that way.
Yeah, that is correct.
And so you don't foresee there's a way to change this?
I do not. No, I do not.
Okay. Right. That's it.
Any other questions in the room?
Apologize. Last time I promise, just a clarification. I had some friends that were confused. They received their approval for their legal non-conforming, and they thought that they still were possibly not going to be able to rent past January 1st. Just to clarify, so that people feel confident that they can rent their properties past January 1st. If you receive a legal non-conforming approval, you will be able to get a short-term rental license when it becomes available. Is that correct?
Correct. As of right now, the January 1 deadline stands. You'll need a license by that date. If we have to extend that deadline, we'll talk about that and get that information out to the public. But yes, if you have a legal non-conforming registration, you will be eligible for a short-term rental license. Any other questions? All right. Well, we had great turnout. I want to thank you all for taking time this afternoon. We had over 70 people on Zoom, and of course, a pretty good size here in the room. So please help us sort of spread the information that you learned. I continually get questions, and I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation being circulated in the community. So if you hear it and you can help clarify, please do. And if not, please send them to the website, send them to the city, so that we can, give people the information that they need to make sure that they have the approvals and the documents and the licenses that they need to conduct these uses. We will likely hold another one of these sessions in the future. So we'll advertise that similar to what we did for today. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we will plan to have one or more sessions similar to this, specific to the licensing process once we get that up and running. So like I said, we want to give you all the tools that you need to get through this as painlessly as possible. So I appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you.